At this point, we've discussed each of the steps in the analytical process, except for the last, where you present your evaluation of information and analysis to answer a question. And I just don't want us to focus on presenting our analysis, but presenting for impact. This is a poster created by Ellie Watson for data acquisition and analysis in GIS here at ACC, in which she analyzed the change in land cover over 19 years in southwestern Travis County for a groundwater conservation district. And I really like how she presented her analysis from using small multiples, where we utilize the same shape and area of southwestern Travis County, but only change the underlying data, in this case land cover, to emphasize trends and changes over time. I like how she quantifies her analysis utilizing a table to reinforce these changes over time, and then links the table back to the graphics utilizing color. And I also like how she succinctly explains her workflow in her introduction, methodology, and results and conclusion. And so this map incorporates a lot of the best practices associated with presenting for impact. If you could only refer to one slide when creating your deliverables for your projects this semester, it would be this slide, which lists the best practice for presenting tables, charts, maps, and text for impact. When incorporating tables into your presentation, make sure you keep it simple. You size it to the data. You left align the text and right align the numbers. Align the column headings with the data. That you use consistent precision and round numbers and remove repetition. For charts, make sure you choose the right chart and emphasize the trends and the relationships, not just the underlying data. That you de-emphasize the external chart elements. Use 2 to 6 colors so it's easy for your audience to map the colors back to the information, and don't use effects like 3D bar charts. For maps, I want you to use the visual hierarchy to emphasize the intellectual hierarchy. Balance your map layout. Arrange the elements to reinforce the purpose. And of course, make sure that you evaluate your map at the end so that it satisfies your purpose, speaks to your audience, and that you've selected an impactful medium. Last, text plays an important role in tying all of these different elements together. So make sure in your text that you tell your story, that you grab your reader, that you emphasize the trends and relationships in your data analysis and overall story. Speak to your audience. Make sure you use clear and concise words and make your point. Now, our intermediate GIS class is different than all of our other GIS classes. Every deliverable associated with a project in intermediate GIS will include an executive summary. And that's because we want you to learn to write engaging and compelling professional documents. And professional documents, of course, don't just include executive summaries. They also are just emails that you're writing to your peers and your supervisors and your clients, memos and letters, project scopes and statements of work, and even detailed project reports. But we're going to focus on executive summaries today and in this semester, because if you can write good executive summaries, then that'll help you in writing those other professional documents as well. And our goal is not just to write an executive summary, but to write with impact by writing in the active voice efficiently and in a conversational tone. Writing in the active voice means writing in an authoritative voice with fewer words that are easier to read. In contrast, writing in the passive voice is writing in an unassertive voice with more words that are often more difficult to read. Now, the passive voice is not wrong. There are times when you want to use the passive voice, but in professional documents, we always want to focus on using the active voice, in which sentences are structured subject, verb, object. The subject acts on the object. In the passive voice, a sentence is structured object, verb, subject. The object is acted upon by the subject. And just in describing the sentence structure, you can hear that a passive voice uses more words and that the focus of the sentence, the subject, is de-emphasized by placing it at the end of the sentence. Now, I love this example. Can you imagine if you had been dating somebody for a few months and you thought tonight's the night? So you go out on a romantic dinner, and at the end of the evening, you look them in the eye and you say, I love you. And then the object of your affection doesn't make eye contact and says, you are loved by me. Now, it's not wrong, and they could probably defend that statement to suggest that they love you, but they're not saying it. And in the professional world, we want to say what we mean. Now, I've provided you with a well-written example and a poorly written example of the active and the passive voice. This example is an executive summary that I wrote to describe the geoanalyzing a serial killing demonstration we did last week. And this is the opening paragraph from that executive summary. In the poorly written example, I lead off with a sentence that states, Austin was terrorized by an axe murderer. This is in the passive voice. The axe murderer is the one that initiated the terrorism against Austin, not that Austin attracted the axe murderer. So stated in the active voice, it would be better written as, did you know an axe murderer terrorized Austin? In the second sentence of the poorly written example, I state, young women in Austin were preyed upon by the servant girl annihilator. Again, it's object, verb, subject. And the problem with it is we're leading with young women. It's like they somehow brought it upon themselves, when in reality, it was the servant girl annihilator that initiated the contact and preyed upon the young women. So this sentence would be better stated in the active voice as the unapprehended servant girl annihilator preyed upon Austin's young women. So subject, verb, object. In the last sentence of the poorly written example, I say, can this centuries old crime be solved with modern computing like geographic information systems? Now, that's not a bad sentence, but again, the GIS is the one that is solving the crime. And so, written in the active voice, I would say, can we use modern computing like geographic information systems to solve this centuries old crime? Here, I'm putting GIS in the forefront of acting on and solving the crime. Now, both paragraphs say the same thing, but one is written in a much more authoritative voice with fewer words, and it's much easier to read. Did you know an axe murderer terrorized Austin almost 150 years ago? One of America's first documented serial killings, the unapprehended servant girl annihilator preyed upon Austin's young women between 1884 and 1885. Can we use modern computing like geographic information systems to solve this centuries old crime? Writing efficiently is using a concise voice with a logical and cohesive flow. Efficient writing is clear and organized. Inefficient writing is cluttered and unorganized. Efficient writing makes every word count. Inefficient writing uses needless words. And so again, I've provided you with a well-written example and a poorly written example from the middle paragraph of the executive summary for the geoanalyzing a serial killing demonstration. Notice in the well-written example, I structure the middle paragraph to communicate my process and my findings. I start off the opening sentence of the middle paragraph with first, the second sentence with once mapped, and then my findings at the end, a strong spatial relationship. There is a clear line of thought and cohesive flow to that paragraph. If you look at the poorly written example, it just jumps in with I mapped. So it's not preparing your audience for the steps in your workflow. In the middle of the poorly written example, I use a big parenthetical, for example, walking time, crime density, and geostatistics. This really takes away from the impact of this paragraph. And at the end of the poorly written example, I state to compare the spatial relationship between the suspect's homes and each crime. Now, it's not a terrible sentence, but it can be stated in a much more succinct and clear voice. In the well-written example, I say, compare the location of each suspect to each crime. Now, one thing I also do when I'm writing is I go back through, read it aloud, and try to find those words that do not add value to what I'm saying, those needless words. In the poorly written example, I said, I mapped the geographic location of each victim and each suspect. In this example, one, I don't really have to say geographic and location. Location says that. And I've also used the word each twice. I can just pull those out and not only say the same thing, but say it with more impact. So in the well-written example, I say, I map the location of victims and suspects. I've taken, what is 7 or 8 words and chopped it down to 4 or 5 words. In the second sentence of the poorly written example, I say, once the source data is mapped. And I realize after writing that, I can just get rid of the words the source data is, and instead, in the well-written example, say, once mapped. In the final sentence of the middle paragraph of the poorly written example, I say the resulting analysis shows that a spatial relationship exists between 2 of the 3 suspects and the victims. I went ahead and rewrote this sentence to be more concisely written as my results, instead of the resulting analysis, show a strong spatial relationship between 2 of the 3 suspects and the victims. So I'm removing the inefficient and needless words to create a more clear and impactful sentence. Last, we want to write in a conversational tone. We want to write in the same way that we would have a conversation with somebody. And the best way to test for this is to read your narrative aloud. It sounds funny if it sounds like you would never talk to somebody this way, then rewrite it so that it is in the form of a conversation. So a conversational tone is easy to read and hear. A formal tone is harder to read and hear. A conversational tone uses simple words and phrases. A formal tone uses complex words and phrases. And so I'll close out my example of the executive summary for geoanalyzing a serial killing with a closing paragraph. The poorly written example utilizes longer phrases like, for example, resided within a 5-minute walk time. And I rewrote that in the well-written example as lived within a 5-minute walk. The poorly written example uses some complex words like geographic mean and incidence. And they're more clearly stated to somebody, especially an audience who might not be as familiar with GIS, as geographic center. And instead of incidents, I use the word killings. Also note the more formal phrase that I use at the end of my paragraph. I believe modern computing would have enhanced the probability. That sounds so official, but it's also a little stuffy. Stated in a more conversational term, in the well-written example, I say, I believe modern computing would have improved the odds. Last, in my closing sentence of the well-written example, I go ahead and throw in the phrase, armed with GIS. I like that phrase because it's like I am arming the law enforcement officer with the tool that they need to capture who I believe is the true serial killer, Jimmy Phillips Jr.